Tonight, we begin with a subject both scandalous and scholarly: the intimate, confusing, and occasionally downright bizarre world of medieval sex and romance. This was an era of chivalry and deeply suspicious herbal remedies, a time when foreplay often meant asking politely and hoping no one was watching, and when the most romantic gift you could give was a recently deceased woodland creature. If you thought modern dating was complicated, imagine trying to impress someone when your main flirting tool was a lute and a prayer. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Before we get comfortable, if you enjoy exploring the strange and often hilarious realities of history that they don't teach you in school, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And I have a question for you. What do you think is the most complicated part of modern dating? Keep that in mind, because it's about to look very simple. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the biggest misconception of all: privacy. The medieval romance did not unfold beneath silk sheets in a candlelit chamber, while a lute played softly in the background. In reality, the setting was usually a small, single-room home shared by an entire family, including your children, your aging parents, a couple of goats, and a chicken who had strong opinions about personal space. Privacy, as we think of it, simply didn't exist. Most peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, lived in homes where the kitchen, the bedroom, and the stable were technically the same square footage, just with different smells. If a married couple wanted some alone time, they had to get creative. Timing mattered, volume mattered, and ideally, so did whether the kids were asleep and dutifully facing the wall. Curtains around a bed were a luxury reserved for the moderately wealthy. Most families shared a single large bed or straw-stuffed mattress on the floor. Even among the upper classes, true privacy was a rare commodity. A lord and lady might have their own bedchamber, but servants might be asleep on pallets at the foot of their bed, or standing in the corner, pretending with all their might not to notice anything. Many noble households kept detailed records of bedroom arrangements for legal and religious reasons, which is exactly as awkward as it sounds. Traveling didn't help either. Inns often featured large, shared beds. That's right, you might find yourself sleeping side by side with a complete stranger for the night, which made romantic encounters even more complicated. Want a little affection with your spouse? You'd better check if there's already a traveling merchant in the bed, and whether or not he brought his boots. If you weren't married, the stakes were even higher. You had to be twice as quiet and 3 times as careful. Communities were small, walls were thin, and gossip traveled faster than plague rats. For those living in monasteries or convents, the rule was simple: no privacy, no distractions, and certainly no late-night whispers. But even there, human nature occasionally made things complicated, which might explain why many abbeys had unusually high garden walls. In the medieval world, the first rule of romance was accepting that you were probably not alone. In the medieval world, few institutions shaped private life more than the church, and it had a lot to say about what went on behind closed doors, or, more accurately, behind shared curtains. According to the dominant church teachings of the time, physical intimacy had one, and only one, primary legitimate function: procreation, making more little Christians. That was it. Not pleasure, not bonding, not stress relief, just reproduction. Everything else was seen as distracting at best, and deeply sinful at worst. This wasn't just Sunday sermon material. Bishops, theologians, and confessors wrote detailed instructions, or penitentials, outlining precisely what was and wasn't acceptable, just in case anyone dared to improvise. The preferred, and often only, permissible method was what we now call the missionary position. It was deemed the most natural for procreation, and therefore the least likely to offend God, the saints, or your local priest. Anything else, any variation that might hint at a pursuit of pleasure over duty, was considered suspect, unnatural, and potentially sinful. That includes things like enthusiasm. One 13th century guide for married couples suggested that they should engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, which is, by all accounts, a fairly joyless checklist. Another theologian, Saint Jerome, argued that a man who was too ardent a lover of his own wife was, in fact, an adulterer. The ideal was to approach the marital act with a sense of pious duty, not passion, and the Church didn't just have opinions on how, it had very strong opinions on when. If you think modern couples have trouble syncing their schedules, spare a thought for medieval folks. Planning a romantic evening required a calendar, a priest's blessing, and the luck of St. Valentine himself. Sundays were absolutely off limits. That was the Lord's Day. Fridays were also out, as a day of penance in memory of the crucifixion. Wednesdays were often forbidden as well. Add to that the entire season of Lent, 40 days, the season of Advent, another 40 days, and various major feast days, fast days, and holy days, and you'll find the calendar was less of a schedule and more of a divine obstacle course. Some confession manuals outline nearly half the year as off-limits for marital relations. If you were feeling particularly affectionate during one of those forbidden days, well, enjoy your spiritual guilt and an extra long trip to confession. Of course, the upper classes, with their personal chaplains and confessors, were more exposed to these strictures. Peasants, meanwhile, whose lives revolved around the rhythms of agriculture, livestock, and not freezing to death, often had a more flexible and pragmatic approach. Still, the shadow of the Church loomed large over the medieval bedroom, attempting to regulate not just actions, but desires themselves. If the Church's rulebook wasn't complicated enough, navigating courtship in the Middle Ages was like playing a game of chess, where all the pieces were invisible and the rules changed depending on who was watching. For most people, especially outside the peasantry, marriage was primarily a business deal. Daughters were exchanged to cement political alliances, acquire property, or secure peace between two families who had previously disagreed over whose pig ate whose prize-winning cabbage. A bride might come with a dowry of coin, linens, or a small patch of highly desirable farmland. In return, the groom's family might promise financial security, social advancement, or just to be generally less insufferable. Romantic love, while not unheard of, was considered a happy bonus, not a prerequisite. As one medieval proverb more or less stated, better a wealthy match with a grumpy face than a poor one with dimples. Courtship, when it happened at all, was a highly supervised affair. Young people rarely, if ever, courted alone. A maiden of good standing would be watched over by her mother, a stern aunt, or, if things got really serious, an entire village that was very invested in whether or not you held hands for too long. This doesn't mean love and attraction didn't exist. It just meant people had to get creative. A whole coded language of romance developed, one built on subtle gestures, hidden meanings, and plausible deniability. Take eye contact. For example, in modern romance, we're told it builds connection. In medieval Europe, it could build suspicion, an engagement contract, or a lawsuit, depending on how long you held it. Too brief, and you seemed uninterested. Too long, and you were essentially proposing marriage or challenging her father to a duel. Manuals on courtly love advise that a man should gaze softly yet sincerely, a phrase that sounds like something from a 14th century perfume ad. The ideal stare was somewhere between, "I deeply admire your embroidery skills, and I am not currently planning to invade your family's estate." Poetry was another popular tool, especially for the socially awkward noble who had more access to ink than to charm. But here's the twist. The most acceptable way to express affection wasn't by praising your beloved's beauty directly. That was too worldly. Instead, you were advised to compare her to divine figures, ideally the Virgin Mary, because nothing says "I want to court you modestly" like you remind me of the Holy Mother of God. These poems were often deeply religious, partly to appease the church, and partly so that if things went wrong, you could just claim the poem was meant for a nun. And what about gifts? While modern dating might involve flowers or chocolates, a popular gesture of love in medieval Europe was a recently deceased woodland creature. To demonstrate bravery, masculinity, and excellent aim, knights frequently gifted their beloveds the spoils of the hunt. A bouquet of roses was nice, but a freshly slain boar's head, still slightly steaming, that was the real way to say, "I think about you when I'm throwing spears at things." This wasn't considered strange. In fact, it was encouraged. A lady receiving a skinned rabbit was expected to act delighted, even if she was internally wondering where to store her third hare of the week. If this all sounds incredibly complicated, you're not wrong. Medieval romance was a minefield of unspoken rules, religious anxiety, and very, very public expectations. If you are fascinated by this bizarre world of medieval dating rituals, please take a moment to hit the like button. It tells me you enjoy these deep dives into the intimate and often strange side of history. Let's clear up one of the most persistent and frankly, weirdest legends about medieval relationships: chastity belts. Yes, you've probably seen them in cartoons, historical dramas, or very unfortunate museum gift shops. Those iron contraptions, allegedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband went off to war or on a pilgrimage, designed to keep her physically and morally sealed, except not really. There is no solid historical evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. In fact, most of the examples we have today actually come from the Renaissance, or even the 19th century Victorian era, periods that were more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than with what actually happened. Many of these belts were likely created as joke items for cabinets of curiosities, as satirical warnings against infidelity, or as outright forgeries to sell to gullible collectors. Medieval manuscripts, which often record all sorts of uncomfortable and intimate details of daily life, are suspiciously silent about mass belt distribution. No tailors advertised custom fittings, no laws regulated their use, and no churches handed them out during awkward pre-crusade marriage ceremonies. It's almost as if, and stay with me here, they weren't actually a thing, which makes perfect sense, because the design is wildly impractical. Medieval hygiene was already questionable. Now imagine adding a rusty, chafing metal contraption with no user manual, and a padlock that would probably require a blacksmith to open. It would have caused far more infections than it ever prevented indiscretions. So where did the myth come from? Likely from a combination of later moral panic and satire. Renaissance moralists and Victorian historians loved the image of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. It fit their narrative of the Dark Ages, and nothing says virtue enforced like a literal keyhole in your underpants. In reality, fidelity was enforced through more traditional and far more effective means: shame, constant surveillance, religious doctrine, and strategic matchmaking. Noble women were often chaperoned within an inch of their lives. Peasant girls had entire villages watching them like a team of unpaid private investigators. Any whiff of scandal could lead to a ruined reputation, a lost dowry, or an awkward confession involving phrases like, "at the edge of the barley field." So while the idea of a chastity belt is a powerful one, it tells us more about later centuries' anxieties than it does about the medieval reality. In a surprising twist that would shock many of their modern descendants, medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels. In many cases, they regulated them as legal, tax-paying businesses. This pragmatic approach stemmed from a cynical but common belief among officials. Allowing a controlled outlet for men's desires would reduce the chances of greater sins, like assault, adultery with respectable women, or, heaven forbid, dancing on feast days. Regulated brothels were seen as a necessary evil to keep society orderly. The church, of course, officially condemned the entire practice, but unofficially, many clergy and city officials turned a blind eye, and some even collected rent from the very same establishments. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations. You've grasped the essence of medieval public policy. Let's set the scene. Candlelight flickering. Your beloved whispers sweet nothings, and then removes their woolen tunic to reveal a powerful medieval musk. When it came to personal hygiene, medieval Europe had priorities. Staying clean was on the list, just somewhere after surviving the plague and catching the pig that got into the pantry again. Bathing did happen, but not nearly as often as modern noses would hope. Peasants might bathe once a month, more if they fell into a river. Soap was expensive and used sparingly. Even public bathhouses, which did exist, were sometimes banned during outbreaks of disease. Now, imagine trying to impress someone under these conditions. Perfume, mostly for the elite. Deodorant, a dream of the distant future. Dental care. You might rub your teeth with ash or chew on mint leaves. Kissing was certainly an adventure, and yet people still found ways to fall in love, flirt, and get close. Perhaps our standards were different, or perhaps when everyone smelled equally of wood smoke, sweat, and mild disappointment, love was truly blind and nose blind. Despite what church authorities like to pretend, not every medieval couple waited for the wedding bells. Premarital intimacy was common enough that local courts had a whole system of fines for it. And what about same-sex attraction? It absolutely existed. We have records of love poems, letters, and deep emotional bonds between people of the same sex, particularly in the single-sex environments of monasteries and convents. Officially, it was a sin. In reality, life was, as always, much messier. So, after all this, the arranged marriages, the fines for flirting, the suspicious herbal remedies, the public bath habits, and the church warnings against smiling too much, you might be wondering, did medieval people actually fall in love? The answer is a resounding yes. Awkwardly, passionately, and sometimes even happily. Despite the rigid social structures and the moral sermons, love found a way to bloom in the cracks. Peasant couples courted in fields and marketplaces, trading favors, flowers, and whispered gossip over turnips. Noble lovers exchanged intricate poems and secret glances during formal banquets, while pretending to be fascinated by a long speech about falconry. We have their letters between spouses, especially during times of war or long separation, show real affection, deep longing, and profound commitment. We have records of couples who defied their parents to marry for love, and widows who remarried not for land, but for companionship. Because even after all the rules, the risks, and the rituals, the fundamental human need for connection remained. People still wanted to feel loved, to build a life with someone, to find a partner to endure the hardships of a difficult world with. The path to love was certainly different. It was more public, more practical, and fraught with far more rules about what you could do on a Tuesday. But the destination, a shared life, a deep bond, a sense of belonging to another person, was remarkably the same. What do you think is the biggest difference between medieval romance and dating today? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the surprisingly complicated heart of the Middle Ages. If you found it fascinating, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious. In the early 1600s, the Dutch Republic was about the size of a pancake and just as flat, a modest patch of reclaimed swamp clinging to the edge of Europe. It was a nation seemingly designed by committee, with no grand mountains, no vast resources, and a constant, nagging suspicion that the sea might one day ask for its land back. And yet, for one brief, dazzling century, this tiny, damp republic would punch far above its weight, becoming the richest, most innovative, and most artistically brilliant nation on earth. While the rest of Europe was busy with monarchical drama and religious wars, the Dutch were quietly inventing modern capitalism, pioneering global trade, and commissioning portraits of themselves looking sternly at cheese. This is the story of the Dutch Golden Age, a time when a nation of merchants, painters, and engineers built an empire of light, money, and oil paint. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Tonight, we journey to the bustling canals and velvet-lit rooms of the 17th century Netherlands. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories that explore the complex intersection of art, commerce, and culture, please consider hitting that subscribe button. And I have a question for you. What do you think is more powerful in shaping a nation? Its military might or its economic power? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's travel back to a time when the most valuable thing in the world wasn't gold, but a shipload of nutmeg. The Dutch Golden Age was born from an act of rebellion. After nearly 80 years of Spanish rule, a period of religious persecution, and heavy taxation, the fiercely independent provinces of the Netherlands finally had enough. In 1648, with the Peace of Westphalia, they officially declared their independence. What followed was less a carefully planned national strategy and more of an entrepreneurial free-for-all. Imagine Silicon Valley, but everyone wears wooden shoes and invests in herring futures. If the Dutch Golden Age had a beating heart, it wasn't in a palace or a parliament. It was in the chaotic, bustling docks of cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam. While France polished its wigs and Spain was still counting its gold from the New World, the Dutch were busy building the most formidable merchant fleet the world had ever seen. At its peak, the Dutch Republic had more ships than England, France, Spain, and Portugal combined. But these weren't just fishing boats with an attitude. These were fleets, revolutionary cargo ships designed for maximum space and minimum crew, making them incredibly cost-effective. They were the floating warehouses of a global enterprise, carrying everything from timber from the Baltics to silk from China, spices from Indonesia, and sugar from Brazil. The engine of this global trade was a groundbreaking invention, the world's first multinational corporation, the Dutch East India Company, known by its formidable acronym, the VOC. Founded in 1602, the VOC was capitalism before it was cool, or even particularly ethical. It was the first company to issue stock, allowing ordinary citizens to invest in its voyages and share in the profits. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange became the financial center of the world, a place where fortunes were made and lost on the promise of a single shipload of cloves or cinnamon. The VOC did whatever it took to protect its profits. It had its own private army, built fortresses across Asia, and engaged in ruthless colonial tactics to secure its monopoly on the spice trade. The Spice Islands, in what is now Indonesia, became a theater of brutal conquest. While the VOC was ruling the East, the West India Company handled business in the Atlantic, which included the trade of sugar, rum, and, most darkly, enslaved people. The Dutch involvement in the transatlantic slave trade was not incidental. It was a systemic and profitable part of their economic empire. The same nation commissioning serene paintings of milkmaids was also meticulously cataloging human lives on a ledger. The Golden Age had a deeply tarnished underside, yet amid this brutal efficiency, the Dutch also brought a kind of order to global trade. Their ships sailed on set routes, their cargoes were insured, and their ports were clean, secure, and shockingly well managed. They weren't just navigating oceans, they were navigating economics. While other countries sent explorers and conquistadors, the Dutch sent accountants with muskets. Their empire wasn't just built with swords, it was built with balance sheets. While Dutch ships were hauling goods across continents, something else was happening back home. quietly, almost silently. In the towns and homes of the Dutch Republic, a girl poured milk from a ceramic jug. A woman laced her pearls in a sun-drenched room. A letter was read in silence beside an open window. And with every one of these mundane moments, a man named Johannes Vermeer was turning ordinary life into eternal poetry. Vermeer was not the most famous painter of his day. In fact, he was a relatively minor figure, producing a grand total of about 35 known works in his entire lifetime. That's less than what Rembrandt might have sketched in a single productive week. But what Vermeer lacked in volume, he made up for in sheer radiance. His paintings are calm, composed, and eerily luminous, as if someone figured out how to paint sunlight holding its breath. What set him apart? A near mystical understanding of light and a painstaking precision. The interiors he painted weren't just backgrounds. They were characters in their own right. You can almost hear the creak of the wooden floors, feel the cool air from an open window, and sense the quiet passage of time. And that is the secret of Dutch Golden Age art. While the outside world raced forward with trade and war, artists like Vermeer captured the sacredness of slowness, of intimacy, and of the private, inner world. Of course, Vermeer's magic wasn't performed in a vacuum. This was a society that adored images. The average Dutch home in the 17th century had more paintings on its walls than many aristocratic palaces elsewhere in Europe. They bought landscapes, portraits, still lifes, seascapes, and a generous number of paintings featuring dead fish arranged artfully on tables. They loved it all. Why? Because this was the world's first great middle-class society. The merchants, bakers, brewers, and butchers had money, and they had taste. They didn't want grand paintings of floating cherubs or bloody battles. They wanted art that looked like their world, but slightly better lit, and the painters delivered. Dutch art became an industry fast, detailed, and refreshingly local. But back to Vermeer. His works weren't flashy or political. They didn't shout. They whispered. And in those whispers were volumes about solitude, reflection, and the quiet drama of domestic life. He painted what was often overlooked and made it unforgettable. But outside his peaceful, sunlit rooms, a different kind of Dutch obsession was brewing, one that would dazzle the world and then spectacularly implode. If you are enjoying this exploration of art and history, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps our channel reach more people who appreciate these stories. Picture this. You walk into a tavern in Amsterdam in the year 1636. A man next to you offers to sell you a single tulip bulb. Not a bouquet, not a field, just one bulb. The price, the same as a grand house on one of the city's finest canals. And the truly crazy part, you seriously consider it. Welcome to Tulip Mania, the fever dream of early capitalism, and possibly the world's first recorded speculative bubble. The Dutch didn't invent tulips, which were imported from the Ottoman Empire, but they perfected the art of monetizing them. Tulips, especially the rare, striped broken varieties, which were actually the result of a virus that made them more beautiful and unpredictable, became the ultimate status symbols. Owning a unique bulb like the legendary Semper Augustus was like owning a supercar today, except you had to dig it out of the dirt and hope no one accidentally made soup out of it. At first, it was just wealthy collectors, but soon everyone wanted in. Farmers, artisans, chimney sweeps. If you could hold a coin and had a pulse, you were speculating in tulips. Entire family savings were spent. Futures contracts were invented, allowing people to trade the rights to bulbs that hadn't even bloomed yet. It wasn't about flowers anymore. It was about flipping a promise before the petal ever showed. For a brief, dazzling moment, tulips were the Bitcoin of the 17th century. Then came the crash. In February of 1637, the market suddenly seized up. People stopped buying. Maybe they blinked and realized they were mortgaging their homes for plants. Maybe someone actually saw a prized tulip bloom and thought, wait, that's it. Prices collapsed. Fortunes vanished overnight. Suddenly, that one bulb you paid the price of a house for was just a a bulb. You might as well plant it and try to enjoy the view. Strangely enough, the Dutch economy didn't fully collapse with the tulip market. It was deeply embarrassing. Yes, there were lawsuits and public sermons about greed and vanity, but the Republic shrugged, dusted off its doublets, and moved on. While tulips were being traded like jewels, something else was quietly blossoming in the Dutch Republic. The mind. They didn't just ship goods. They shipped ideas. And in the 17th century, that was a dangerous business. At a time when publishing the wrong opinion in Spain or France could get you burned at the stake, the Netherlands became a haven for writers, philosophers, and rebels with quills. The Dutch had a relatively tolerant attitude toward free thought, at least as long as it didn't interfere with trade. This meant that books banned elsewhere flowed out of Amsterdam's printing presses. The French philosopher René Descartes wrote and published some of his most influential works here. Baruch Spinoza, the excommunicated Jewish philosopher who argued that God and nature were one and the same, lived and thought in relative peace. Universities like Leiden became intellectual magnets, drawing students from across Europe. The Dutch Golden Age wasn't just built on water. It was built on ideas. Imagine a city built like a painting, straight lines, soft curves, and everything in its proper place, even the ducks. That was Amsterdam in the 17th century, a masterpiece of urban design brought to life by engineers, merchants, and a stubborn refusal to let water win. The Dutch didn't just build cities, they drained them into existence. At the heart of this watery miracle was the canal ring of Amsterdam. It was elegant, efficient, and about as close as urban planning gets to poetry. Concentric canals carved the city into districts. Goods moved by boat, not cart. Rich merchants built the now iconic narrow houses with steep steps and grand gabled facades. Those tall, slender houses weren't just an aesthetic choice. They were a tax strategy. Property taxes were based on the width of the house, not its height. So, people built upward, not outward, squeezing luxury into vertical elegance. The result was an architectural skyline that looked like gingerbread real estate and smelled faintly of Calvinist restraint. And it all served as a message. The Dutch Republic wasn't about kings or cathedrals. It was about cities, citizens, and civic pride. For all its brilliance, the Dutch Golden Age was not a utopia. Behind the tulips and oil paintings lay a republic built on tension, political, religious, and military. Politically, the Dutch Republic was a complex jigsaw puzzle of provinces, each jealously guarding its own rights. The real power lay with the wealthy merchant class. Religiously, the Calvinists were in charge, and other faiths were only tolerated as long as they kept quiet. And internationally, the Dutch were now a major power, and the old guard of Europe didn't like that. The English, once their Protestant allies, now saw them as economic rivals. This led to a series of Anglo-Dutch wars, brutal naval brawls where both sides lost ships and pride. Meanwhile, France under Louis XIV had grown aggressive, and the resulting wars were incredibly expensive. The Dutch could juggle commerce, culture, and colonies, but they couldn't juggle forever. The cracks in the Golden Age had begun to show. Golden Ages don't typically end with an explosion. More often, they fade, quietly, awkwardly, like a party where the best guests have already left. The Dutch Republic in the late 17th and early 18th centuries wasn't collapsing. It was simply sighing. Trade remained strong, but competitors were catching up. England and France were getting better at naval warfare, and even better at copying Dutch business models. Innovation slowed. Painters started repeating what sold: more cows, more ships, more sleepy windmills. Art became safe. Banking became cautious. The energy had shifted. The final blow came not as a single disaster, but as a shift in the global winds. The Age of Enlightenment was dawning elsewhere. Britain took the crown as the world's leading financial and naval superpower. France was setting the stage in art and science. And the Dutch, once the marvel of Europe, found themselves quietly edged out of the spotlight. But the legacy of the Dutch Golden Age never disappeared. It lives on in our modern world, in libraries, in galleries, and in the very foundations of our global economy. The Dutch streamlined capitalism with the world's first stock exchange and shareholder corporations. In art, Vermeer's quiet light and Rembrandt's stormy faces taught us that greatness could be found in the ordinary. In ideas, their relative tolerance allowed thinkers to publish works that pushed Europe toward the Enlightenment, and in their cities, they showed the world a model of urban life built not for kings, but for citizens. In the brief, brilliant glow of that one century, the Dutch showed the world a new model of success, one powered not by royalty, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. What do you think is the most important legacy a nation can leave behind? Is it its art, its ideas, or its economic innovations? Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious. Forget stadiums, sponsorship deals, and national anthems. The very first Olympic Games had none of that. There were no timers, no slow-motion replays, and certainly no celebrity endorsements. There was just dust, sweat, a sacred olive tree, and men competing in the nude for the glory of the gods. The year was 776 BCE, and the location was Olympia, a quiet religious sanctuary in southern Greece, dedicated to Zeus himself, the king of the gods, champion of lightning bolts, and, apparently, an enthusiast for athletic excellence. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Tonight, we journey back to the origins of the world's greatest athletic spectacle, to a time when sport was not entertainment, but a form of prayer. Before we begin, if you enjoy exploring the deep roots of our modern traditions, please take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell. And I have a question for you. What do you think is the ultimate purpose of sports? Is it entertainment, personal excellence, or something more? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's travel to a time when winning didn't earn you a medal, but a chance at immortality. To the ancient Greeks, the Olympic Games weren't just about flexing your glistening, olive oil-covered biceps in front of a crowd. They were, first and foremost, a sacred act of worship. The athletes were not simply competitors, they were pilgrims, and Olympia was not just an arena, it was one of the most important religious sanctuaries in the entire Greek world. Nestled in a lush, green grove called the Altis, Olympia was more temple than stadium. The entire site was a testament to the power of the gods, particularly Zeus. The most important structure was the magnificent Temple of Zeus, a colossal Doric masterpiece that once housed one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a gigantic, 40-foot-tall statue of Zeus, sculpted by the master Phidias from ivory and gold. It was said that the statue was so awe-inspiring that to gaze upon it was to forget all your earthly troubles. This was the divine referee, looming over every contest. The rituals began days before the first race was ever run. The athletes, who had to arrive a month early for supervised training, would begin the festival with a solemn procession to the altar of Zeus, Horkeos, Zeus of the oaths. There, standing before a fearsome statue of the god holding a thunderbolt in each hand, they would swear a sacred oath, with their families and trainers present, promising not to cheat, bribe an opponent, or engage in any malice. Breaking this vow was not just poor sportsmanship, it was sacrilege, an offense against the king of the gods himself. Cheaters who were caught were heavily fined, and the money was used to build bronze statues of Zeus, called Zanes, which lined the entrance path to the stadium. Each statue was inscribed with the name of the cheater and his city, an eternal monument to their shame. And then there were the sacrifices, lots of them. The centerpiece of the festival was the hecatomb, the ritual sacrifice of 100 oxen at the great altar of Zeus. On the 3rd day of the games, a grand procession would lead the animals to the altar, where their throats were cut and their thigh bones burned as an offering to the gods. The smoke, the chanting, the smell of blood and burning meat. It was all part of a massive communal offering. The rest of the meat was cooked and shared among the thousands of spectators, turning the games into a sacred barbecue on a divine scale. Fire was also central to the ceremony. Sacred flame, believed to have been lit by the pure rays of the sun using a concave mirror, burned perpetually at the altar of the goddess Hestia. This ancient tradition directly inspired the modern Olympic flame and torch relay. For the Greeks, every aspect of the games was steeped in religious meaning. Winning meant Zeus himself had smiled upon you. Losing meant, well, maybe you should have sacrificed another ox. The first Olympic Games may have started with a single-foot race, but things escalated quickly. What began as one man sprinting roughly 600 feet turned into a sprawling, 5-day festival of events that tested every aspect of the male physique: speed, strength, skill, and how well you could fight someone half covered in olive oil. Let's begin with the basics. Running. After the first event, the stadion, a single sprint down the length of the track, more races were added to the program. The diaulos was the ancient equivalent of the 400-meter dash, one length of the track there, and one back. Then came the dolichos, a long-distance race that could last for up to 24 laps of the stadium, totaling nearly 5,000 meters. Imagine running that far in the blistering Greek summer sun, completely naked. No high-tech running shoes, no water breaks, just you, your feet, and probably some very uncomfortable dust. For those who wanted an even greater challenge, there was the hoplitodromos, a race where competitors ran wearing a heavy bronze helmet, greaves, and carrying a shield. It was a test of not just speed, but of the strength and endurance required of a Greek soldier. A final, grueling tribute to the martial spirit of the games. But it wasn't all about speed. The Greeks adored combat sports, and their games reflected that raw passion. Wrestling, or pale, was a technical and highly respected affair. No biting or eye gouging was allowed, but pretty much everything else was fair game. An athlete had to throw his opponent to the ground 3 times to win. It was the cerebral cousin of the far more chaotic pancration. The pancration was an all-out, no-holds-barred combination of boxing and wrestling, where almost anything went. Punches, kicks, chokeholds, and joint locks. The rules were simple: don't kill your opponent, at least not intentionally. It was violent, brutal, and one of the most popular events. Boxing, called pygmachia, was just as savage. There were no padded gloves, just thin leather straps called hymantes wrapped around the knuckles, leaving the fingers free. These were designed not to soften the blow, but to protect the puncher's hands. Matches had no rounds and no time limits. They simply continued until one man surrendered by raising a single finger or was knocked unconscious. It was less float like a butterfly and more survive with your teeth intact. For the ultimate all-around athlete, there was the pentathlon. This was a 5-event spectacle consisting of the long jump, discus throw, javelin throw, the stadion race, and wrestling. The long jump was unique, performed with stone or lead weights called halteres held in each hand, which athletes would swing forward to supposedly increase their momentum. The discus and javelin were not just about distance, but also about style and form, reflecting their origins as skills of warfare. And finally, the most prestigious and dangerous event of all, the chariot races, held in a vast arena called the hippodrome. These races, with 2 or 4 horse teams, were a spectacle of wealth, speed, and spectacular crashes. The interesting twist: it was the owner of the horses who was declared the victor, not the driver who risked his life. This meant a wealthy aristocrat could hire a skilled charioteer, and if his team won, he would receive the olive wreath and the glory. It was the ultimate display of status. Each of these events pushed men to their absolute limits, but they weren't competing for gold or money. They were chasing something far more valuable in the ancient Greek world: the kleos, eternal fame. If you were dreaming of participating in the ancient Olympic Games, I hope you were Greek, male, and very, very comfortable being nude. The games were sacred, prestigious, and about as exclusive as a Spartan wine club. The rules were strict, the requirements were intimidating, and the list of those allowed to compete was very short. First and foremost, athletes had to be free-born Greek men, not slaves, not foreigners whom the Greeks called barbarians, and certainly not women. The Olympics were a showcase of Greek masculinity in all its oiled-up glory. Competitors came from city-states all across the Greek-speaking world, from Athens and Sparta to colonies in Italy and modern-day Turkey, but they all had to prove their Hellenic bloodline. Citizenship was a birthright, and without it, you weren't setting foot on that track. And then there was the nudity. Competing nude was the standard for almost all events. Why? The reasons are debated, but it was likely a combination of factors. The Greeks believed the male body was an expression of divine perfection, and competing without clothes was a way to honor the gods and display that physical excellence. It was also practical in the intense heat, and it made it harder to cheat by grabbing an opponent's clothing in combat sports. Whatever the reason, it was a fundamental part of the game's identity. Training wasn't optional. It was a brutal, lifelong commitment. You didn't just show up at Olympia and hope for the best. Athletes had to prove they had been in continuous training for at least 10 months prior to the games. Then, they had to arrive in the nearby city of Elis 1 month before the festival began for a final, intense period of supervised training. This wasn't a casual pastime. It was a full-time job. Officials called the Hellanodikiai, who served as both judges and organizers, would observe the athletes during this month and had the power to disqualify anyone who wasn't up to standard. There was no room for slackers. Now, about women, they were, with very few exceptions, banned from competing, and married women were forbidden from even attending the games as spectators, under penalty of death. Unmarried women, however, were permitted to watch. The one major exception was the priestess of Demeter, who was given a seat of honor opposite the judges. But that didn't mean women were entirely excluded from sport. They had their own separate festival at Olympia, the Heraean Games, held in honor of the goddess Hera. These games consisted of foot races for young women and girls of various ages who, unlike their male counterparts, competed fully clothed. In the end, the games were as much a mirror of Greek society as they were a contest of athletic prowess. Proud, patriarchal, intensely competitive, and meticulously regulated. To the casual observer, the games were a festival of sport and religion. But beneath the laurel wreaths and wrestling matches, something far more strategic was at play: politics. In ancient Greece, everything was political, including who could throw a discus the farthest. The games offered the perfect opportunity for the often fractured Greek city-states, the polis, to meet, compete, and engage in the ancient equivalent of international public relations. Winning an event didn't just bring glory to the athlete, it brought immense prestige to his home city. A victory was a billboard for your hometown's superiority, proof that your citizens were stronger, faster, and more favored by the gods than your rivals. City-states funded and trained top athletes as a matter of civic pride. Victories were immortalized in commissioned poems by famous poets like Pindar, and statues of the victors were erected both at Olympia and back in their home cities. An Olympic victor was a celebrity, a war hero, and a propaganda tool all in one. But the Olympics weren't just for flexing muscles. They were for forging alliances. Political leaders and diplomats from across the Greek world used the games as a neutral meeting ground. Treaties were negotiated, alliances were announced, and political deals were struck in the shade of the olive trees. Even military campaigns were often timed around the Ekechiria, or Olympic truce. This was a formal agreement, announced by heralds traveling from city to city, that all Greek states would cease hostilities for a period before, during, and after the Games, allowing athletes and spectators to travel to Olympia in safety. In theory, it was a beautiful moment of pan-Hellenic peace. In reality, it was more of a polite suggestion. Some wars did pause, but the truce was occasionally violated, leading to fines and even bans from the Games. Sparta, naturally, was famously banned on at least one occasion for its typically warlike behavior. The sanctuary itself became a kind of ancient leaderboard. Wealthy city-states that had won battles or amassed fortunes would build ornate treasuries at Olympia to house their offerings and flaunt their success. The entire site was a political and artistic arms race in marble and bronze. Even cheating had political consequences. If an athlete was caught bribing an opponent, the shame fell not only on him, but on his entire city. A black mark on its reputation in the fiercely competitive world of Greek rivalry. If this journey back to the heart of ancient competition is fascinating you, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps these stories of our shared human history reach a wider audience. The Games are over. The dust has settled. The crowds are heading home. But for a select few, those crowned with a simple wreath of olive leaves, life is never going to be the same again. In ancient Greece, an Olympic victory wasn't just an athletic achievement, it was a full-blown life upgrade. Winning at Olympia meant you had received the direct favor of Zeus himself, and that kind of divine endorsement came with serious earthly perks. Victors returned to their home cities as heroes. They were greeted by cheering crowds and parades. Statues were raised in their honor in the city square. Poets were hired to compose long, dramatic, and extremely flattering odes celebrating their strength and virtue. Some cities tore down a section of their defensive walls to welcome a victor home, a symbolic gesture suggesting that a city with such a hero no longer needed walls for protection, and the rewards were tangible. Many victors were granted free meals for life at the public expense, a far better prize than a gold medal, especially in a world where your next dinner wasn't always guaranteed. They were given front-row seats at festivals and theaters. Wealthy patrons would line up to be their sponsors. Their families would arrange better marriage prospects. They were no longer just men. They were legends. But with fame came immense expectation. Olympic victors weren't allowed to fade into obscurity. They became symbols, living proof of their city's greatness. Some were appointed as generals or sent on important diplomatic missions. Their bodies had earned them glory, and now their names had to carry that glory for the rest of their lives. For the Greeks, the ultimate prize was kleos, immortal fame. It was the chance to be remembered, not just by your children or your city, but by history itself. And that's what made the Olympic Games more than sport. They were a forge for legacy. For over 1,000 years, the Olympic Games blazed like a sacred flame, held every 4 years with remarkable consistency, even through wars, political upheaval, and plagues. But even the most sacred traditions are not immune to time. By the 4th century CE, the world had changed. The Roman Empire had conquered the Greek world. The Games continued, but their religious meaning began to fade. The Romans enjoyed the spectacle, but the idea of sport as divine devotion didn't resonate as deeply in a culture that preferred gladiatorial combat to nude wrestling. Then came the final blow. In 393 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I, a fervent Christian, issued an edict that banned all pagan festivals and cults throughout the empire. This included the Olympic Games. After more than a millennium of continuous tradition, the sacred flame at Olympia was extinguished. The temples were eventually destroyed or fell into ruin. Earthquakes and floods buried the site under layers of silt and sand. the sanctuary fell silent. For centuries, the games lived on only in legends and ancient texts, until the late 19th century, when that old flame flickered back to life, inspired by the ideals of ancient Greece. A French aristocrat named Baron Pierre de Coubertin spearheaded a movement to revive the Olympic Games as a modern, international competition. And so, in 1896, the first modern Olympics were held in Athens, Greece, fittingly, in the very land where they began. Today's games are bigger, louder, and significantly more clothed, but echoes of the original still remain. The 4-year cycle, the sacred torch lit at Olympia, and the pursuit of excellence. And it all began with a cook named Koroibos, a single foot race, and a wreath of olive leaves, beneath the watchful gaze of Zeus. What do you think is the most important ideal from the ancient games that we should carry into our modern world? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious. The year was 1791, and the United States was less a country and more a very expensive, very fragile experiment. The revolution had been won. The ink on the new Constitution was barely dry, but the war had left behind a mountainous debt. The fledgling federal government was broke, and the most urgent question on everyone's mind in the temporary capital of Philadelphia was, who is going to pay for all this? Enter Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, a man who didn't just love strong financial systems, he worshipped them as the bedrock of national power. Hamilton's plan was audacious: consolidate the state's debts under the federal government, establish a national bank, and, here's the kicker, raise revenue through federal taxes. And not just any tax, but an excise tax on a product he knew the country produced and consumed in vast quantities: distilled spirits, better known as the whiskey tax, to Hamilton and the Eastern elites. It made perfect sense. Whiskey was a luxury for some, a staple for others, and taxing it seemed like a fair and reliable way to fill the government's empty coffers. But out on the western frontier, in the rugged, isolated hills of Pennsylvania and Kentucky, farmers had a very different idea. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Tonight, we explore the first great challenge to the authority of the United States Constitution, a story of taxes, liberty, and a stubborn refusal to be governed from afar. Before we dive in, if you enjoy stories that uncover the deep conflicts that shaped nations, please take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell. And I have a question for you. What do you think is the fairest way to tax a population? Is it based on income, property, or the goods people consume? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's travel back to a time when a tax on whiskey was enough to bring a new nation to the brink of civil war. To understand why Western farmers exploded with rage over a whiskey tax, you have to understand the frontier mindset of the 1790s. Life west of the Allegheny Mountains wasn't just hard. It was a different world. Roads were often little more than muddy, impassable trails. News from the capital in Philadelphia could take weeks to arrive, and the federal government felt like a distant, foreign power. For these frontier farmers, whiskey wasn't a luxury item enjoyed in a city tavern. It was the very lifeblood of their economy. Transporting bulky crops like corn and rye over the mountains to eastern markets was nearly impossible. So, farmers did what they had done for generations. They distilled their excess grain into whiskey. A horse could carry only a few bushels of grain, but it could carry the equivalent of 24 bushels if that grain was converted into liquid. Whiskey was durable, it didn't spoil, and most importantly, it was a stable and widely accepted form of currency. In a region where hard money was scarce, a gallon of Monongahela rye could be used to pay wages, trade for nails, or buy a pig. The whiskey still in the barn wasn't just a piece of farm equipment. it was a bank. Hamilton's tax, passed in 1791, felt like a direct assault on this way of life. Worse still, the structure of the tax seemed deliberately designed to punish small producers. Large distillers in the East could pay a flat annual fee, which was more manageable and less intrusive. But small, backwoods farmers were taxed by the gallon. This required government inspectors, complex paperwork, and cash payments they simply didn't have. To them, it felt like a punitive measure designed by Eastern elites to crush their small operations and favor large, wealthy producers. To these men, many of whom had fought in the Revolution against what they saw as tyrannical British taxes, this felt like a profound betrayal. The war had been fought over the principle of no taxation without representation, and now a distant federal government was reaching deep into their pockets and their barns. They saw it as an attack on their liberty, their property, and their very survival. The seeds of rebellion were planted, not in the halls of Congress, but in log cabins and backwoods taverns, where the talk turned from frustration to open defiance, and it was all over whiskey. At first, the resistance was a campaign of classic civil disobedience. Tax collectors were ignored, forms were left unfiled. But as the government pressed the issue, the resistance grew more organized and more violent. Federal officials trying to enforce the tax found themselves on the wrong end of angry mobs. In western Pennsylvania, the heart of the resistance, federal tax inspector John Neville became a symbol of everything the farmers hated. He was a wealthy landowner and a prominent figure, one of the few men brave or stubborn enough to actually try and collect the tax. Collectors working under him were harassed, threatened, and attacked. One was stripped, whipped, tarred, and feathered, and left tied to a tree in the woods, a frontier fashion statement with a very clear message: go home. When the federal courts in Philadelphia issued subpoenas for distillers who had failed to pay, the situation escalated. CEO Marshal David Lennox, tasked with serving these rights, became a target. For the farmers, being summoned to a federal court hundreds of miles away in Philadelphia was an impossible burden, equivalent to financial ruin. It felt like another deliberate tactic to punish them. By 1794, this was no longer a protest. It was an open insurrection. The flashpoint came in July of that year, when Marshal Lennox, accompanied by John Neville, attempted to serve a writ at the farm of William Miller. An armed group of farmers intercepted them. A shot was fired. It's unclear by whom, and the officials were forced to retreat. The next day, the rebellion exploded. A mob of several hundred armed men, some of them decorated Revolutionary War veterans, surrounded Neville's fortified home, Bower Hill. They demanded he resign his post and hand over his tax records. Neville refused, and a gun battle erupted. The rebels, now numbering close to 600, set fire to Neville's home and outbuildings. A rebel leader was killed, and Neville's defenders, a small group of soldiers from nearby Fort Pitt, were forced to surrender. Bower Hill was burned to the ground. The message was unmistakable. The frontier was not bluffing. This was no longer about a tax. It was about who held power. In the days that followed, the resistance coalesced into a full-blown mobilization. A rebel militia of nearly 7,000 men gathered outside Pittsburgh, calling themselves the Defenders of Liberty and proudly flying a flag with 6 stripes, representing the rebellious counties. They talked of secession, of forming a new country west of the mountains. To many in the federal government, it was beginning to look like Shays' Rebellion all over again, but with more guns, better organization, and a lot more whiskey. This was the first great test of the new American Constitution. The question was no longer whether the government had the right to tax, but whether it had the power to govern at all. If you're finding this story about the fragile beginnings of a nation compelling, please take a moment to hit the like button. It supports our channel and helps us bring more of these crucial histories to light. By the fall of 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had escalated from a regional disturbance to a direct challenge to the authority of the United States. In Philadelphia, President George Washington watched with growing alarm as his carefully stitched republic began to unravel at the seams. This was no ordinary law and order situation. It was a constitutional crisis. Washington understood precisely what was at stake. If the rebellion succeeded, or if the federal government failed to respond decisively, it would set a disastrous precedent. It would signal to the entire nation and to the world that the laws of the United States could be defied with impunity. The young republic could fracture before it even had a chance to stand on its own 2 feet. Urged on by his hawkish Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, Washington made a decision that stunned the nation. He would not just send a message, he would deliver it in person. He decided to lead the army himself. Washington thus became, and remains, the only sitting U.S. president to personally command troops in the field. For a man who had famously relinquished power after the Revolution, this was not an act of ego. It was an act of grim necessity. He wanted to demonstrate, in the most powerful way possible, that the Constitution was not just a piece of parchment, it had muscle. Washington mobilized a massive federalized militia of nearly 13,000 troops, an army larger than the one he had commanded at Yorktown. Militiamen from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia were called up. They assembled as they had in 1776, except this time, they weren't marching against the British. They were marching west to face their own countrymen. Washington rode out in his full military uniform, a solemn and imposing figure. His presence was intended to intimidate, and it worked. As word of the massive army marching westward spread through the frontier, the rebellion began to dissolve. The fiery rhetoric and brave talk of secession evaporated in the face of overwhelming federal force. Many of the rebels had assumed the government would send a few marshals or write some angry letters. They had not expected the President of the United States at the head of a formidable army. By the time the federal troops reached western Pennsylvania, most of the rebellion had melted away into the hills. Its leaders had either fled or gone into hiding. Local support for the cause vanished. The show of force had succeeded without a single major battle. Once he was certain the region was secured, Washington handed command over to General Light Horse Harry Lee and returned to Philadelphia. His point had been made with crystal clarity. The federal government had the right to pass laws, and it had the power to enforce them. When Washington's army arrived in western Pennsylvania, they didn't find a battlefield. They found silence. The rebel militias had vanished, and towns that once brimmed with fiery anti-tax sentiment now greeted federal troops with suspiciously polite smiles. The rebellion had ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper. But justice, or at least the appearance of it, still had to be served. Federal troops began rounding up suspected rebels, ultimately arresting over 150 men. Many of them were more confused than combative, swept up for simply being in the wrong tavern at the wrong time. The government wanted to show it meant business, but it also needed to avoid looking like a tyrant crushing poor farmers. It was a delicate balance. The arrested men were marched back east for trial in a grim procession that was meant to be a public display of federal authority. In the end, only 2 men were convicted of treason, a capital offense, and then, in a final, masterful act of political wisdom, Washington pardoned both of them. Why? Because Washington understood that sometimes unity is more important than punishment. He had already made his point. The law had been defended. The Constitution had held firm. Executing a couple of whiskey rebels would have gained nothing. It might have turned them into martyrs, inflamed public opinion, and reignited the flames of resistance. Instead, Washington extended mercy. It was a calculated move, but also characteristic of his leadership style. Firm in principle, but restrained in action. His goal was not vengeance. It was precedent, and that precedent was now crystal clear. The federal government had the authority to govern all its citizens, and it would use force if necessary, but it would also temper that power with prudence. for many on the frontier. However, the rebellion and its suppression confirmed their worst fears, that the federal government was a tool of Eastern elites who cared little for their lives and livelihoods. The resentment simmered, and it would soon find a powerful new voice in the political arena. The muskets were quiet, the rebels had dispersed, but politically, the real battle was just beginning. The Whiskey Rebellion didn't just test federal authority. It exposed the deep fractures in the new republic's identity, and at the center of this divide were two towering figures with wildly different visions for America's soul: Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, the architect of the whiskey tax, saw the rebellion's suppression as a resounding victory for order and national survival. For him, the show of force was proof that a strong central government was essential. His ideal America was industrial, commercially powerful, and respected on the world stage. The rebellion was, in his eyes, a dangerous bout of lawlessness that had to be put down decisively. But Jefferson saw something entirely different. Jefferson, who had been serving as Secretary of State, was appalled not by the rebellion itself, but by the government's military response. To Jefferson and his growing base of agrarian supporters, sending a 13,000-man army to confront angry farmers over a liquor tax looked terrifyingly like the actions of a European monarchy. This wasn't enforcement. It was intimidation. He feared Hamilton's vision would create a nation run by bankers and wealthy merchants, not by the independent, virtuous farmers he saw as the bedrock of the republic. The Whiskey Rebellion became political ammunition. Jefferson and his ally, James Madison, began to organize formal opposition to Hamilton's Federalist policies. Their movement, soon to be known as the Democratic Republican Party, framed themselves as the protectors of liberty, the rights of states, and the common man against an overreaching federal government. The Federalists, in turn, painted Jefferson's camp as dangerous radicals and mob sympathizers who would plunge the nation into chaos. The rebellion, in other words, crystallized America's first political parties. Lines were drawn. Newspapers took sides. The debate over the whiskey tax became shorthand for a much larger struggle between centralized power and local autonomy, between the Hamiltonian vision of a strong, unified nation and the Jeffersonian vision of a decentralized confederation of sovereign states. So while the rebellion was crushed militarily, it lived on politically, becoming a foundational story that both parties would retell to their advantage. For Federalists, it was a story of how the Constitution held firm against anarchy. For Democratic Republicans, it was a story of how a powerful government had overstepped its bounds and threatened the very liberties the Revolution had been fought to secure. After all the drama, the military march, and the political fallout, the whiskey tax itself had an unceremonious end. Despite the government's show of force, enforcement remained difficult and unpopular in the western counties. The tax never generated significant revenue and cost more to collect than it was worth. When Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, ushering in what he called the Revolution of 1800, one of his first acts was to appeal to his frontier supporters. In 1802, the whiskey tax was repealed by Congress. The controversial tax that had sparked a rebellion and helped define the nation's first political fault lines disappeared quietly. With the stroke of a pen, the law had held, yes, but the people had spoken, and in the end, their voices, channeled through the political process, had won. The legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion is a complex one. It was the first and only time a sitting U.S. president led troops in the field. It was the first major test of the Constitution's authority. But more than that, it established a pattern that would echo throughout American history: the ongoing, often contentious, debate between federal power and individual liberty. It wasn't just about whiskey. It was about who gets to make the rules, who has to follow them, and what happens when people believe those rules are unjust. History may have aged the whiskey, but the questions raised by the rebellion still burn. What do you think the Whiskey Rebellion teaches us about the balance between law and protest today? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the turbulent youth of the United States. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious.